All right, if you will open up your Chumashim, please. You'll need, I don't have handouts, all you need is your Chumash. And if you'll open up your Chumashim, to page 374 for Parshat Bo. Page number 8.
Maybe we do this last year.
Around this time?
I think I remember.
No, it was earlier last
It
year.
was early, that's what.
Because this year, everything's late.
That's what it was.
Oh,
You're okay with it. She keeps falling for you, Larry.
Not yet,
Come join us.
oh, on both sides, oh my God, really?
Okay, so once again, we're on page, 374 Parshat Bo. And the first observation I'd like to share with you is that I believe that one needs to look at last week's portion of Vayera and this week's portion as one portion, okay? With a part A and part B, because they really are intertwined. And as you know, last week's Parsha dealt with the first 7 plagues, and this week's Parsha deals with the next 3. So, and some of the issues that we have, some of the challenges we have run through both Parshiot. Notably, and let's look at the very first verse, because here's the first problem that we have. If somebody will read. Sure, please.
Then the Lord said to Moses, go to Pharaoh, for I have hardened his heart and the hearts of his courtiers, in order that I may display these my signs among them, and that you may recount in the hearing of your sons and of your sons' sons.
Okay, so what I wanted to focus on is this whole concept of God hardening Pharaoh's heart, okay? It's a problem. And you're all shul goers, you've probably heard lots of sermons and lots of commentaries about what this means. And what's the problem? The problem is that if God is hardening Pharaoh's heart, then he doesn't have free will, that he didn't do this on his own. So why are you going to punish him for something that he couldn't control? And so there are lots of opinions, and I'm going to tell you right off the bat, they're nice stabs. This is a problem. And I'm going to share with you some of the traditional and more contemporary explanations, interpretations of what this means. But I'm going to tell you personally, I don't find any of them to be plausible. All right, we're going to get into that. Yeah.
All right, I think I don't know if I said it to the whole class, I just said it to the rabbi on Thursday. And that is that God hardened Pharaoh's heart, not for Pharaoh's sake or Egyptians' sakes, but for the Israelites' sakes, because they weren't ready to believe and have faith.
Right.
And it actually says that here, so that I can display my signs among them, meaning the Israelites.
Right, and we're going to get into that, but that still doesn't solve the problem. The problem is God manipulating Pharaoh's heart, okay? So let's look at some of the explanations that have been given. And who better to start with than Rambam, the Maimonides. Maimonides suggests that God doesn't harden Pharaoh's heart until the 6th plague, okay? Well, he's still hardening God's, it still doesn't solve the problem. Maimonides says the first 5 plagues he teaches are 5 pleas to Pharaoh to reject his ways and repent, even if repentance is motivated out of fear, okay? Another explanation, and I wasn't able to locate whom to attribute this quote to. It says that Pharaoh gradually hardens his own heart by becoming increasingly more stubborn with the passing of each plague. For example, at the beginning, sin, like a spider's web, can be removed with little effort. In the end, it becomes sturdy. Or to phrase it a bit differently, sin enters first as a traveling passer, later as an invited and welcome guest, finally as a complete master. The conventional wisdom is that we all possess the freedom to choose. Perhaps, however, when we engage in wrongdoing, freedom of choice is diminished as we become more deeply involved.
How true.
Okay. Our Eitz Chaim Chumash takes a stab at this as well, and one that's similar to the opinions I just shared. Their commentary in our Chumash says that the first 5 plagues, the text reads, Pharaoh's heart was hardened. That is, he himself chose to be stubborn, only for the last 5 plagues do we read God hardened Pharaoh's heart. In the beginning of the process, Pharaoh was equally free to be generous or to be stubborn. Every time he chose the option of stubbornness, however, he gave away some of his free will. Each choice made it more likely that he would choose similarly the next time. He was determined not to admit that he had been wrong and was equally determined not to give in to Moses. Okay, so these are nice stabs at it, but it still doesn't take away from, basically they're saying it increased, over time, Pharaoh was hardening. At first, Pharaoh was hardening his own heart, and then God stepped in, or just from repeated patterns that, the more that he sinned, the more prone he was to doing so. But it still doesn't fully answer the question, okay? What does this mean? And do we believe that God actually intervenes and hardens somebody's heart? And this problem comes up again later in the parsha in a different context, and we're going to get to that shortly. So what do you think? What are
I
your
think
thoughts?
it's true, because I think
Which-
we see it with children. We see it with parents. We see it with a lot of people who become more and more stubborn. In other words, the more you say no, the harder well, with a kid, you say no, and then he starts getting into tantrums, as do adults, and they're going to win no matter what.
I agree. I agree, but it's still, I agree with you 100%, but it still doesn't solve the problem. Is God intervening and actually hardening Pharaoh's heart?
So I have 2 thoughts. One is, why are we surprised that God's getting involved at this level? In all of Genesis, I mean, God works behind the scenes. God says, go here. God says, go there. Yeah, people have free will, but when God tells you to go do something, most of the people have already done it. God changes hands, or suggests a lot of things. So we're not surprised by
But
that.
this is subconscious. Okay,
Joseph had dreams, lots of things get motivated in a way that we're not clear, that we later attribute to God. Okay, so in this case, as the history's evolved, so instead of a dream, so now it's a hardening of the heart. And that's my second point. My understanding was in biblical times, the heart, unlike how we think of it now, wasn't the seat of emotion, it was the seat of thought. And so the hardening of the heart could be interpreted as a sharpening of their intellect during that period. And it was their intellect that maybe still left free choice to look at the situation more clearly, whether it was good for them or not good for them. And then the stubbornness was a result of that. It's like, wait, you want to take our slaves away? This is a problem. My intellect is telling me one thing, because maybe if they weren't as sharp, they might be making different decisions. Pharaoh doesn't always listen, as we hear in this parsha, to his advisors. Now, I'm not saying his sharpness of intellect in that point made the right decision, but clearly he's exerting a stronger decision-making process than maybe we might have seen otherwise. Just an idea.
Okay,
I don't think that God would have physically hardened the heart of Pharaoh. I think Pharaoh's heart was hardened from the actions of God. Very similar to what Sheila said. Yeah.
all possible. There actually, and what we know is there's no, as is often the case in studying Torah, there's no definitive
Yes.
answer here. Yeah.
Yeah, here there was.
So
Right.
nevertheless, we'll have some fun with it. So kind of picking up on what Bill was saying, and maybe to sharpen the question without really giving an answer, maybe the point is, do we want to believe that God, if you will, takes over the mind of this individual who theoretically has free will and makes it so that we want to say his intellect is hardened, he can't change his mind? Do we want that? Do we want to accept that?
As I say, clearly the rabbis had a problem with this, which is why they wrestled with it and why we continue to come back and revisit this challenge. I'll give you another point of view. I'm sorry. Yeah, I'm sorry. Please, go ahead. Go ahead, please.
If power would have said yes right away, where is the power of God?
Right.
So there is another way of looking at it, that he wanted to make a point to show his strengths.
Well, we're gonna get back to that in another way relative to the number of plagues. So I think
There's
there's,
two comments
please,
there.
yeah, go ahead, please.
Nelson first.
Who's first? Nelson, go ahead.
Yeah, when Joseph has dreams, he doesn't say that he's the interpreter. He says God's the interpreter. He's just the mouth of God, in effect. And it's the same problem, but it doesn't emphasize the fact that God's in charge. And we like to suppose God's in charge everywhere. It isn't that God's manipulating. It's just that we live in God's world.
Somebody else had her hand?
Ivan.
Ivan, yeah.
I think you have to look at this as, you know, you look at someone like Vladimir Putin or Xi Jinping or Maduro in Venezuela or any dictator or tyrant throughout history. They never want to give up power. Never. It doesn't matter if their civilizations are falling apart, becoming impoverished. Look at North Korea. The Torah is teaching us here that there are people, and Pharaoh thought Ramses, son of the Son of God, okay, that he could not give up the power. He could not let them go because he was addicted to his own obsessions, to furthering his own causes. And another thing is that God has intervened, but he's intervened for the purpose of taking revenge on Pharaoh and to some extent the Egyptians, and to show that his power is the only real power, as opposed to the gods of Egypt, the sun god and the gods of the waters. And so
We're gonna get into that in a bit. That's a very good observation. So look, one other, you take on whatever interpretation you're most comfortable with. But I think one other possibility is that this is simply a figure of speech, that it is as though the Pharaoh was acting as though God had hardened his heart. And this concept comes up again, and I apologize, we're going to be skipping around back and forth within this portion, but you'll see how it all comes together. Let's go forward. You can keep your finger back there, but take a look at page 388. You go to page 388, and I know, Nelson, you need chapter and verse. We're talking about chapter 12, verse 36. So at the top of the page in the Eitz Chaim Chumash. Somebody want to read verse 36?
And the Lord had disposed the Egyptians favorably toward the people, and they let them have their requests. Thus, they stripped the Egyptians.
Okay, so this has to do with when the Israelites were leaving and the Egyptians gave them gifts. And we're gonna come back to that again too. But the point that I wanted to make is, again, we have this concept of somehow God directly influencing people's actions. Okay.
The word stripped also is not a nice word.
No, but again, that's
Probably
not,
not what the Hebrew says.
yeah. And I'm gonna come back to that.
Not
Yeah,
fluid.
yeah, I'm gonna come back to that, yeah.
I have no idea what
so-
the word is.
Maimonides states in his guide for the perplexed that God never interferes with human freedom and that divine providence never takes the form of divine intervention to punish the wicked. So here, again, Maimonides has problems with this too. And basically, the way I read what Maimonides is saying is that God if God doesn't intervene with human freedom, then he would not have actually either hardened Pharaoh's heart or inclined the Egyptians to give gifts to the Israelites when they were leaving Egypt. Now, Rabbi Shai Held, who is a living rabbi, a modern commentator, somebody who's I think is very wise. He's got, by the way, he has two books on 2 volumes on the Parsha, his commentary on the Parsha, which are very good. I highly recommend them. And Rabbi Held says, there comes and I think he summarizes all this actually quite well. He says, there comes a point when a person has become so totally entrenched in bad behavior that he simply loses the ability to choose any other path.
Yeah.
Human nature is such that freedom at a particular time may be constricted by decisions made earlier. God can be said to have hardened Pharaoh's heart only in the sense that God created human nature this way. Okay, so that's basically along the same lines of what my point of view is. I think this is very well expressed. So now let's move on to another challenge that go ahead.
Do we feel, of course, we're reading the story because it's pertinent to us, but I would have to assume he has all these courtesans, he has all these advisors, that this isn't the only problem that comes across the Pharaoh's desk throughout his rule. And so even though for us, it's a very important one, but for us to think, oh my gosh, this is the hardest decision up until all the substantial plagues later
Right.
that Pharaoh has to deal with. I can't believe that he's ruling an entire country and the like. So I'm not so sure. It's like, oh my, what do I do? What do I do? Kind of feeling of Pharaoh. He's probably dealing with it the way he deals with everything, with that authoritative. Maybe his heart is hardened every time a decision has to come.
Could be.
And we don't know this.
Could be.
So to back up historically what Bill has just said, we know from finally understanding hieroglyphics that the Egyptians consider Pharaoh one of their gods. We also know that, from various stele and other archaeologically uncovered elements that lots of stuff was going on at this time in the New Kingdom. Not to say the least, all kinds of building projects. And if this set of slaves somehow goes free, there are a whole lot of other sets of slaves from a whole lot of other origins, whether from wars or what have you. And I think that in some sense, we also know that the Egyptians don't like to record their losses. So it's certainly arguable that the fact that they don't say anything about it at all is just that it would be embarrassing for them to say anything. But in this period in the New Kingdom, you'd be more focused on all the temples and palaces that are being built to celebrate Pharaoh than on whether some of the slaves managed to get away.
Okay,
From an Egyptian point of view.
so the next question that
Egyptian
we
thought.
deal with is,
Right.
an obvious question is, why 10 plagues? Why not one plague? Why not one plague? One big plague? Thoughts?
Yeah, I have one that tying together what Helena and Bill said, and I think actually Ron also said earlier. Maybe it has something to do with the way the Israelites themselves are viewing however it is they're going to end up getting out of Egypt, which at the beginning, we already know they don't believe is really going to happen and that Moses has just made their lot worse by complaining and asking. So one could say, picking up on what Helena said, that God's hand was in all of it. And it could have been one plague or maybe no plagues. But we needed to see 10 plagues in order to be convinced that it was God's hand.
Even the 10 wasn't enough because you see what happened at the Red Sea and again with the golden calf.
Sure.
What has happened throughout Jewish history?
I mean,
It wasn't going down.
all those lovely quotations about how much better it was in Egypt with the
Right.
flesh pots and the fish and all the rest of everything.
Right. You remember in the high holiday liturgy, we say,
We wouldn't have been
we
done.
say we're an kashay orev, a
Yes.
stiff-necked people, right? We're stubborn people.
Is that the same as saying we have hardened hearts?
I think it's also the
It's
the
also,
other
but
side
that
of the coin is-
stubbornness. That
The other side
stubbornness
of it-
is. All
Go
right, go
ahead.
ahead. The
I was just gonna
stubbornness is
say the
also
other
an
side of
asset.
I'm sorry, go ahead, Sheila. Go ahead.
Go ahead. I'll shut up for a change. Go ahead.
It's also, the stubbornness is also one of our assets.
It's kept us going.
Yeah,
Yeah, go
What
ahead.
kept it, yeah.
Yeah,
I guess maybe the flip side of this coin, again, picking up on what Ron said, is if God's acting in history, and we have this marvelous deliverance in the Exodus, so why the Crusades? Why the Holocaust? Why all these other things? Where is God then? One might be inclined to ask. So yeah, we're stiff-necked people. We
if somebody could answer that question, you
Yeah.
would be the wisest person on the face of the
Saying,
earth.
that's why.
You know, we know, we're wise enough to know that there are questions to which we have no answers.
and if we have the humility anywhere, we're not gonna have the humility of Moses because that's the icon, right?
Right.
The epitome of humility. But if we have any at all, I guess we have to say that we don't have those answers. We're probably never gonna have those answers, at least until maybe Mashiach comes. So we have to figure out a way to go
Or
forward.
when we pass on, who knows? So it says, so one of the commentaries I found to answer this question, and I found a few that I like, suggests that the plagues had a twofold purpose. One, to punish the Egyptians, and perhaps more importantly, and some of you have hit on this, to impress the Israelites, laying the groundwork for a heritage and covenant that extends into modern days, some 3,000 years later. So, and I love this analogy. Comparing to the number of plagues, consider an attorney who's trying to win over a jury. He or she builds a case with several points. Additionally, multiple plagues makes the point that what happened was not simply an accident of nature. So then remember, you all remember early in the narrative when Pharaoh brazenly says, "Who is the Lord that I should heed him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, nor will I let Israel go." God's plan and response, and again, this is Shai-Held's point of view, is to make certain that God's dominion is never again questioned, which is the reason why for multiple plagues, for emphasis, and to win over a reluctant Moses, because remember, he was very reluctant in the beginning, to win over a reluctant Moses, an unbelieving Pharaoh, and a crushed and dispirited Israel, and a proud and ruling Egyptian people.
Yeah, but that doesn't explain why it's 10 rather than 11.
We're gonna get to
Well,
that.
but-
Okay.
But I
Okay.
do have an answer for that, if
Okay.
you'd like to hear it.
Yeah, well, I'll get to you in a minute, okay?
No one else does. so
Well,
just
we're gonna
text
come back
it
to them in a minute, okay? So another point of view suggests that if Moses had let the Israelites go after the first plague, Pharaoh would not have changed his ways. He would have continued to be a tyrant. And somebody else was talking, you were talking about tyrants before. He would have continued to be a tyrant, perhaps finding some other group to victimize. Pharaoh was so evil that it would take 10 plagues to make a permanent impression on him. Okay, so now why the number 10?
Right. I say it's just one of those magical numbers
Yes.
in Judaism, because it's
Yeah.
10 well, I'll start at the beginning. It was 10 statements that created the world. There was 10 generations from Adam to Noah. There were 10 generations from Noah to Abraham. There were 10 plagues. There were 10 commandments, et cetera, et cetera. It's just one of those
And-
magical numbers.
10 per million.
10 per million. So yeah, I agree with you. It's just one of those magical numbers.
And
Okay.
Aseret
No, I want to add a point to it. In Babylon, it was 12. And it was a way of saying it's not the Babylonians who understand the world.
And how
There's
many
something
fingers do we
different
have?
about it.
That's what Sheila
Yeah,
just said.
exactly. Okay. So now let's
How
look
many
at
of it?
Wait a
page.
minute, there's a message here that,
Go ahead.
that we learn from the plagues and all of this. I mean, the first and second plague are, blood in the water and frogs in the water. And you think about what the Egyptians did at the beginning. Pharaoh commanded that every firstborn male be drowned, okay, and that in the Nile. Okay, so the Nile is bloody. The second plague is about frogs. Okay, and frogs, the god of frogs was called Heket. Okay, and that meant midwives. They were
Yes.
called midwives. Okay, so the midwives were told to kill the male for the male children. And now we get to the 10th plague, where the Egyptian firstborn, no matter what gender, and plus animals and so forth, would be killed, so that the Egyptians would have to feel the retribution, to suffer, to learn what it means to suffer, just as the Israelites did during those plagues. So there we had in the Noahide laws the idea of whosoever sheds the blood of man, by man shall his blood be shed. And so this is, in a way, a parable that is communicating to us, teaching us these ideas that our God is a God that intervenes in history. And here he did. He took one nation, the only God that could take one nation out from another nation, right? And that there's meaning in history. And there's, and not only that, but it's providence, that we are moving towards something better, but who knows when.
Very good. So some of your points have been echoed by Rabbi Jonathan Sachs. You may read him. We'll talk
Yeah.
about. Have you read Rabbi Sachs? Because he hits on some of those points as well.
Yes,
Right.
he's my
Here's your go-to guy. He's the go-to guy for a lot of people, and we're gonna get into some of those points that you've made that he actually that came from him. All right, so let's move on and take a look at. I want to go to page 375 for a moment. The middle of the page, verse 7. Here we have I believe, a new development here. Okay, once again, 375, middle of the page, verse 7. Somebody want to read that?
Pharaoh's courtiers said to him, "How long shall this one be a snare to us? Let the men go to worship the Lord their God. Are you not yet aware that Egypt is lost?"
So, to the best of my knowledge and recollection, this is the first time, this is a new perspective here, that now his advisors are finally saying to him, you know, what you're doing isn't working. We're gonna have to change course. And when I started to prepare this, my notes a couple of weeks ago, I was thinking about al-Assad in Syria. Because if you have heard the reports that he too, his advisors were saying, you know, things are falling apart here. And like Pharaoh, he chose to ignore them. Okay, now let's go forward to page, this is actually still on page 375. I want to take a look at verse 9. And we're going to read verse 9, and then I just kind of want you to keep this in the back of your head, because we're going to come back to a very important point here. So as long as we're on page 375, if somebody would read verse 9, please.
Moses replied, "We will all go, young and old. We will go with our sons and daughters, our flocks and herds, for we must observe the Lord's festival."
Okay, note that he says sons and daughters first, and we're gonna come back to that in a bit. So, and you know, along the lines of what was said just a few moments ago, Rabbi Jonathan Sachs was saying relative to the plagues that some of them were directed towards the Egyptians, because they were you talked about the Nile and the Hapi and who was the god of fertility. The plague of frogs would have been associated by the Egyptians with Heket, the goddess who was believed to attend the birth as a midwife, as you pointed out, and who was depicted as a woman with the head of a frog. Okay, and then relative to the 9th plague, darkness, contained in this week's Torah portion, at first glance, darkness does not appear to have been as severe as the other plagues, but Sachs notes that the greatest god in the mind of the Egyptians was the sun god. So thus he contends that God's purpose here is to prove his superiority by bringing the darkness. Okay. Now let's go to just skip to the next page, page 376, verses 16 to 20. If somebody would read. So about halfway down on the page.
Pharaoh hurriedly
What
summoned.
chapter are we in?
I'm sorry, Nelson, this is chapter 10, verse 16.
Pharaoh hurriedly summoned Moses and Aaron and said, I stand guilty before the Lord your God and before you. Forgive my offense just this once and plead with the Lord your God that he but remove this death from me. So he left Pharaoh's presence and pleaded with the Lord. The Lord caused a shift to a very strong west wind, which lifted the locusts and hurled them into the Sea of Reeds. Not a single locust remained in all the territory of Egypt. But the Lord stiffened Pharaoh's heart and did not let the Israelites go.
So this reminds me of a movie from a number of years ago. And if somebody, I can't remember the title of the movie. I'm going to tell you this, what happens in the movie. And if anybody remembers what the title of the movie is, you can have another half of bagel on me, okay? So this is a movie with Burt Reynolds, okay? And I don't remember the title of the movie, but I remember this one scene that Burt Reynolds decides that he's going to commit suicide, and he's on a beach and he starts to swim out into the water. And after he's swum out a certain distance, he has a change of heart. He starts to swim back to shore and he says, God, if you let me get back, I will give, it was a wealthy man, I'll give 100% of it, I'll give it all to charity. And as he gets closer to shore, if you let me get back, I will give 75% of it. He gets closer again. Lord, if you get back safely to the beach, I'll give 50%, you know? So I don't remember. So this is this concept of, you know, of Pharaoh saying, you know, just stop the plague, you know, and then once the plague stops, then he goes back and he hardens his heart again. Anybody know what that movie was? Anybody see that movie? It was years ago.
Did he have a hat? Isn't that the other joke?
Did he have a hat? No, I know that joke. No, he didn't have a hat.
But what's interesting here is
Yeah.
that Pharaoh asks Moses, Moses asks God, so that Pharaoh seems to understand that Moses is the important person, for one thing, and God listens. I mean, he would know if he has, you know, the question again of free will and what does God really want to do is God is, if he hardened his heart and he knows he's going to do it again, why doesn't he just be through with it now?
Who are we talking about now? Who?
God. In other words, God, he wants Pharaoh, and I guess he wants the Jews more than Pharaoh, the Israelites rather, more than Pharaoh, to understand what he's doing. And Pharaoh is just being made use of.
And note that, you know, God accomplished his goal. We was going to talk about this a little later on, but God accomplished his goal because here we are 3,000 years later, still talking about this and teaching it to our children.
A couple of things, and you could probably help me out there because I think there's, well, no, I'm not a history guy. I found it fascinating. I think there's a political component that the locusts came in on the eastern wind and then they were blown out with a western wind. And I think I've read somewhere it has to do with enemies of Egypt, east and west, that sort of stuff. And I don't know that. But if you do, bring it forward. It's not that critical, but it's interesting.
It's a kind of an interesting idea because the kind of axis of the ancient world at the time, from Egypt's point of view, would have faced north and east, and they had dominance at times and not dominance at others. I mean, the New Kingdom's been around for a while by this time. So for them, it would definitely be a matter of history that what the New Kingdom replaces is a bunch of Semitic kings who came in and called themselves Pharaoh because they picked up on Egyptian ways, but were actually coming from north and east, Canaan, and points even further perhaps, the Hyksos, if you will. And the new kingdom is what restores Egyptian full ethnic sovereignty, if you will. And at this time, whichever the Pharaoh of the Exodus is or isn't, you've had a tremendous economic boom and on the backs of all kinds of slaves probably, but others as well. The pharaohs are building enormous temples to themselves and palaces for themselves. And we just got back from an exhibit in Denver that focused not on a temple, but on a palace that I hadn't even been familiar with, but it was enormous. What's the point? The point seems to be to make the pharaoh even bigger in the eyes of the average Egyptian and demonstrate that Egypt is very powerful. And then this happens.
And the other thing I was struck with, the foreshadowing of the locust getting hurled into the Sea of Reeds, because that's the fate of the Egyptians who follow the Jews later.
Yeah.
And so, you know, in a way, God's giving them the sense you've been reduced to the level of an insect in a way later.
Very
on.
interesting
you know?
perspective, yeah.
And
Yes.
then the last
Very
thing,
good.
and I don't know what to make of it, the locust came, you know, Moses raised his staff and the locust came. But for them to go away, God just made them go away. And it's never clear to me why, you know, one versus the other is of meaning, if there is.
Well, you know, I've always said there's more that the Torah does not tell us than what they do tell us. So that's why we have commentators, and that's why we have midrash to try and fill in the blanks, because there's so much that's missing. You know, one example I'll give you is that when back in Bereshit, when Jacob ends up marrying Leah, right? And then, you know, and then it says that he worked for Lavan for another 7 years, you know, and then he married Leah, and this happens within the context of 1 or 2 verses, and he said, what the heck happened during those 7 years, you know, between when he married Leah and when he married Rachel, you know?
Actually, it was only a week later he married. Then he worked it
Right.
off afterwards.
Right, but it doesn't tell you, I mean, what happened during all those years?
They
So-
were busy knowing each other.
So anyway.
Well, they didn't do that.
All right, let's
Yeah.
skip,
This will tell us
let's
something
go
about
now
it.
to page 378. At the top of page 378, and I apologize for jumping around, but there's so many wonderful points of interest to discuss. Nelson, this is chapter 10, verse 28. Okay, if somebody would like to read verses 28 and 29 for us.
Pharaoh said to him, be gone from me. Take care not to see me again.
Wrong
The
water.
moment you look upon my face, you shall die. And Moses replied, you have spoken rightly. I will not see your face again.
But, now turn to page 387. A different Pharaoh. Page 387 and verses 30 to 32. Nelson, this is chapter 12. Chapter 12, verse is 30 to 32. Somebody want to read?
And Pharaoh arose in the night, all his courtiers and all the Egyptians, because there was a loud cry in Egypt, but there was no house where there was not someone dead. He summoned Moses and Aaron in the night and said, up, depart from among my people, you and the Israelites with you. Go worship the Lord as you said. Take also your flocks and your herds as you said, and be gone. And may you bring a blessing upon me also.
So I was always taken by this because
Never noticed
he says,
before.
he says a little bit earlier, says, you'll never see me again. I'll never see you again.
Yes.
And now here they are, you know.
Together
But
again.
you'll never
Together.
see an all-powerful Pharaoh who's arrogant. Now he's got a Pharaoh who's begging and accepting of our God. And so in a way, it's a different Pharaoh, right?
Or
It's
maybe
not-
it's just never say never.
Maybe it's the I mean,
Getting the feeling of.
You see, we just.
you know, that could be.
I get very strong feelings.
You've been studying historical biblical criticism, and that's, well, we know that you know, that certainly we see that in the beginning of the book of Genesis, that that if you take, there's one interpretation, that if you take all the verses in which God is referred to as Adonai and then run all the verses in which God is referred to as Elohim, that they kind of line up that way. So that is, you know, that is a possibility, again, if you're open to biblical criticism, that the reason we have this contradiction here is because we have a combination of multiple sources. It's a good, you know, it's a daring and, you know, a point of view that certainly has been prevalent in conservative Judaism, you know, since at least the 50s, even well before that. So, but it is interesting, you know, it's a contradiction. I don't have an answer. All we have is theories as to why it says in one place they're never going to see each other again, and here, you know, and here they're confronting each other once again.
Because the Torah isn't chronological. You can go that way too.
You could go that way.
Yeah, it's possible. It's possible. All conjecture. Okay,
This is the first time, I'm sorry, that we get this idea of not seeing, if you see a face, you shall die. Because we see that later on Sinai, you know, we can't look at God, we'll die. You know, we're told that our God essentially has that same attribute that this Pharaoh is pretending he has, that if you see me, you're gonna die. I don't know if that comes up elsewhere.
Yeah, well, it was certainly a threat. It was, you know, it was you can imagine what a dramatic scene that was, where they, you know, they had been, this animosity between them had climaxed at this point, you know.
You could also say, though, that it conversely shows the impotence of Pharaoh, because in fact, Moses does show up again and he doesn't
That's what I'm
die.
saying, it's a different Pharaoh, different power
40 years.
structure.
Can I bring up one other thing
Sure,
that's
please.
similar, which, or at least that could be troubling, is early on, it seems like all they're doing is going into the wilderness a distance of 3 days in order to worship, and the implication of that might be that you're coming back. So obviously, they're not coming back. I don't think Pharaoh at this point expects them to come back. So how do you square that circle, so to speak? Maybe the idea is that we're still struggling all these years later to still be worshiping God.
Could be. Okay, let's jump now to page 378. This would be 378, chapter 11, verses 1 to 3. Nelson, chapter 11, verses 1 to 3.
You want it read?
Wait, yeah, please.
And the Lord said to Moses, I will bring but one more plague upon Pharaoh and upon Egypt. After that, he shall let you go from here. Indeed, when he lets you go, he will drive you out of here, one and all. Tell the people to borrow each man from his neighbor and each woman from hers objects of silver and gold. The Lord disposed the Egyptians favorably towards the people. Moreover, Moses himself was much esteemed in the land of Egypt, among Pharaoh's courtiers and among the people. Moses said, thus says the Lord, towards midnight I will go forth among the Egyptians, and every firstborn in the land of Egypt shall die. From the firstborn of Pharaoh who sits on his throne to the firstborn of the slave girl who is behind the millstones, and all the firstborn of the cattle. And there shall be a loud cry in all the land of Egypt, such as has never been or will ever be again. But not a dog shall snarl at any of the Israelites, at man or beast, in order that you may know that the Lord makes a distinction between Egypt and Israel.
Okay, let's go back now to verse 2. Tell the people to borrow, I love this term, borrow each man from his neighbor and each woman from hers objects of silver and gold. They weren't borrowing it. They weren't borrowing it. They weren't going to give it back. But here's the thing.
Like
What's interesting is, and we have the Eitz Chaim Chumash is a wonderful book. But if you know a little bit of Hebrew, if you take a look at the word in verse 2, Daber na be'oznei ha'am vayishalu, okay? Ask. They didn't borrow, so they asked. So, but you know, and again, here we've got this concept of God disposing the Egyptians favorably towards the Israelites. So again, it comes back to the same issue that we had with the hardening of the hearts.
They really did just borrow it though. They borrowed it from the Egyptians. All that silver and gold ended up in the tabernacle. They didn't keep it for themselves.
Or in the Golden Calf.
Or in the
yeah.
golden, well, which they
Yeah.
didn't.
And excuse me,
Yeah.
again, Jonathan Sachs makes the point, like in the year of the Shemitah, when on the seventh, after the Israelite slave is freed, the master is obligated or inclined to give him something when they go, to give him clothing and some money and so forth, so that they depart in a way that's amicable, so that the person does not resent, the slave does not resent those people, and so that the slave is not inclined later to retaliate. It's the same thing here. We wanted to dispose the Egyptians towards feeling, or the Israelites to feel good about, in the end, about what at least the Egyptians helped them out in the end.
What's
So I
very
think,
interesting,
yeah, go ahead. That's one
what's
very
very
good.
interesting, is
I
that
was just
David
gonna say-
again?
I'm sorry, go ahead, Sheila.
No, it's not me.
Go ahead, Sheila.
There are two things. One is, it sounds like the people, they've already gone through 9 plagues and they've had it. And that's one thing. And the other thing that is very interesting is that they suddenly liked Moses. They had respect for Moses. Now, we just had, and David, you're the authority on Egyptian history. There was a period right after where they did not, when Moses kills the man in the desert and all, and they say the new king, the new pharaohs didn't know the Jews. They didn't remember Moses. And here there's somehow a time lag. Moses seems to be
Joseph,
Yeah,
figured.
it's Joseph, they don't remember.
It's Joseph.
So I think, I think,
No. Oh, I see. Okay.
okay, those are both really good explanations, and there are a couple of others. And Sheila had on one that I think was close to what I was thinking, but what both of you have said is very good. So there's another couple interpretations. One is that it was reparations, okay? There was reparations because the slaves had worked and were not paid. So now they're receiving something for all the years in which they were doing all that labor and not being compensated. So again, and this is a little bit of a midrash. If you take a look at our Eitz Chaim Chumash, the commentary that they've got, and again, it's midrash, it's kind of nice. Take a look below the line. Nelson, I'm sorry you don't have this. But it says for verse 2, during the plague of darkness, the Israelites could have plundered the homes of the Egyptians. When the Egyptians saw that the Israelites had not done so, they realized the moral greatness of that people and were inclined to give them the silver and gold they asked for. But the interpretation that comes to mind for me, and it's similar to what Sheila had said, is I think they were saying, just get out of here. You know, you've done enough damage. Your God has done enough damage. Hey, take our gold, take our silver, just get out of here and leave us alone.
I'm not so sure about the darkness, because the Egyptians couldn't move, we were told. And so they would assume the Israelis couldn't move either, Israelites. And so I'm not sure about that. But I think this is the first time that we see it's not God perpetrating a plague. It's really the slaves are now, the power is now back down. The slaves are going and collecting gold and silver. And I think that's a real shift from the power structure of what we had seen through all the other plagues. It's clear that these are now free people who can own gold and act on their own, and it's not just God coming along.
Right, and another point is that, you don't want the Israelites resenting all of this in the end. That they should, later God says, never, don't hate the Edomite in your heart because he was your brother, and don't hate the Egyptians, because you can't hate and be free. If you're going to be a free person,
Very nice.
the burden of hate will drag you down.
Okay. So as we come to the end, I know we're running out of time, so the one point I want to make and then close with another observation. And that is that the story we see with the 10th plague, that the story, as you know, comes full circle. Our story begins with Pharaoh decreeing that all the male children should be thrown into the river. And we have the 10th plague with the killing of the firstborn. Okay, so again, it kind of ties up the story very neatly. Now, I'd like to, we're going to jump around a little bit, so you'll see where I'm going with this. Now, I told you I wanted you to keep in mind chapter 10, verse 9. Okay, that's on 375. And it says, we will all go young and old. Okay, notice the emphasis on children. Okay, now if you go to page 386 and look at chapter 12, verse 26. And somebody will read that. 386, verse 26, chapter 12.
And when your children ask you, what did you mean by this, right? Keep going.
Yeah, keep going.
Oh, you shall say, it is the Passover sacrifice to the Lord, because he passed over the houses of the Israelites in Egypt when he smote the Egyptians, but saved our houses.
Okay, now jump to page 392, chapter 13, verse 8.
And you shall explain to your son on that day, it is because of what the Lord did for me when I went free from Egypt.
Okay, now go to page 393, chapter 13, verse 14.
And when in time to come your son asks you, saying, what does this mean? You shall say to him, it was with a mighty hand that the Lord brought us out from Egypt, the house of bondage. When Pharaoh stubbornly refused to let us go, the Lord slew every firstborn in the land of Egypt, the firstborn of both man and beast. Therefore, I sacrifice to the Lord every first male issue of the womb, but redeem every firstborn among my sons.
What's the common thread? What is the common thread between all of these verses in this book?
Haggadah.
Teach your children.
It's all about the children.
It's all about memory
Well,
and,
that's very easy,
and,
but
and the
the
relationship,
emphasis. Go ahead.
the relationship between history, remembering history, and maintaining, preserving your own freedom.
Yes, that is all true, 100%. But the point that I was going after here was the emphasis on teaching your children. And you like Rabbi Jonathan Sachs, and he says God wants to make sure that the singular defining event in the history of the Jewish people will be part of the heritage of our people into eternity. God wants to ensure that each generation will pass the story on to the next, which is in fact what happened for about 3,000 years. Perhaps here lies the foundation for the emphasis that Jews and Judaism places on education. Sachs quotes an old Chinese proverb: if you plan for a year, plant rice. If you plan for a decade, plant a tree. If you plan for a century, educate a child. He goes on to say, where others build castles and palaces, Jews build schools and houses of study. And as we know, education begins in the home, where children experience, this is me not speaking, experiencing the lighting of candles, Shabbat candles, Hanukkah candles, Kiddush and Motzi on Friday night, perhaps Havdalah, and most certainly, what is the most observed of all Jewish rituals? The Pesach Seder.
Circumcision.
Well,
Only half.
but we know of all the holidays, the one that is most widely observed.
Yes.
And so here we are. So God has accomplished God's goal, because here we are 3,000 years later, observing the Passover Seder and teaching the story and the history of our people, teaching the story of the Exodus. We're teaching it to our children.
What's interesting is he's talking about teaching. He always, and the first one, it's take your sons and daughters. Afterwards, it's only sons that are mentioned.
Well, yeah, it is interesting. And when it says, when it refers to the firstborn, it doesn't specifically say,
Right.
it doesn't specifically say boys, but if you look at the Hebrew, it uses the word bechor. So, and we know from our tradition that the fast of the firstborn on Erev Pesach is only for firstborn boys. So it is interesting that, as you point out, Sheila, that in one place it just says children, in another place it says
They each
boys.
have their role, and the boys and the girls, the sons and the daughters all have to go, but the education, unfortunately, is being communicated through the sons here. The women have maybe other roles that isn't being discussed.
No, but Rashi had only girls and he educated them.
No, I agree in practice, but in how it's in the Torah right now.
And how it's practiced in today's world where in the Orthodox,
Yeah.
it's, there's a great difference
Right.
between how boys are educated and girls, whereas, in conservative Judaism, it's,
Right.
we're equal, we have egalitarian, so.
Yeah,
Well,
because
the
when-
Orthodox are coming around. They now have the female rabbis and they're.
Yeah, but I know there was a nice article I saw in the in Jewish media in the
Right.
past week about that. You probably saw the same article, but it's
In
still,
Philadelphia, the convention.
yeah, but that is only the most liberal constituency within the Orthodox movement. It's still not widely accepted. So they have a ways to go.
That's nuts.
But unfortunately now, in the Orthodox, at least in Israel, they are not teaching them. They are just studying Torah, and their lack of education and general education is lacking. And that's true everywhere in the United States also. The ignorance brings the hatreds. And if you don't educate, they don't even know 2 and 4 to do anymore. Nothing. I mean, it is 56% of adults, I'm talking about adults, not children, and that were in France, don't know about the Holocaust anything. And they were under the Nazis. So what here that they had the Atlantic Ocean was in between the war and the education lakes. And this is the minus of United States. That's why I blame all the anti-Semitic part of it is because of the lack of education in this country.
It certainly validates your point to note that when many of the university students, and these are university students,
Yeah.
are asked after the
They
protest,
refer
which
to them
river and
and they
which sea,
say
and
it's
they don't know.
This is ignorance, and ignorance brings fear and hatreds.
Well,
By the way, which.
They're going backwards
which
instead
sea
of
and all
forward.
Also applies to the Jewish kids.
Well, my pet peeve in this conversation for another time is social media. I have a real problem with social media,
Yeah.
which is really perpetuated ignorance. Perpetuated ignorance.
Said that if you give a child and now every child has a tablet, before the age of 3, the scientists found that there is a decrease in ability of reading and learning and all the mental development.
Well, look at the society we live in. People are just, people are falling, having accidents because they're walking across the street while they're reading their phone.
Yeah. Or
How about all
driving.
all the car accidents because people are looking, texting? It's, we say, what do we say at the end of Eitz Chaim? Kadesh Yameinu Ki Kedem. Renew our days as of old.
And I thought was for one.
We're getting.